North and South Korea have always had a tumultuous relationship since the dawn of their existence, with tensions always drawing the fear of a wider war in the region. However, if war ignited on the peninsula once again, it wouldn't be for the first time since 1953 that a conflict happened. Between the armistice and present day, it had already occurred once before, here from 1966 to 1969. This chain of events is known as the Korean DMZ conflict, otherwise known as the Second Korean War. It's July the 27th, 1953. United States military commanders who are representing the United Nations military command structure and South Korea have met with members of the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. They are here to sign an agreement to end 3 years of war on the peninsula. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire and would split the peninsula with a demilitarized zone, aligning with the 38th parallel. However, this was not the only condition presented that the two sides agreed to. One of these agreements was paragraph 13D, where it specified that the commanders of the opposing sides shall cease the introduction into Korea of reinforcing combat aircraft, armored vehicles, weapons, and ammunition. This essentially meant that the United States could not import any weapons into South Korea to reinforce its bases, making the North feel a little more comfortable about not being invaded by a rogue president. In September 1956, however, Admiral Ranford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, basically said that he wanted to bring atomic weapons or otherwise nuclear weapons into Korea. President Eisenhower and the U.S. National Security Council unilaterally agreed. However, this went directly against the paragraph of the armistice discussed before. So, in order to remove this roadblock, despite some opposition from UN coalition allies, the US directly abrogated paragraph 13D. The North was, understandably, very upset with this decision. This now meant that the US could introduce as many atomic weapons and missiles into South Korea as it liked, putting the North into a very vulnerable position. Revoking it also meant that the US could reinforce its fortifications in the South, making the South less likely to be liberated by the North in the future. However, you could also say that this means that there's nothing stopping the North from accessing atomic weapons. This is something that would bite America's ass decades later. But in 1956, North Korea was not even a decade old, and their allies weren't willing to share their expensive nuclear secrets so willingly. The North could also never match whatever the US could offer conventionally or otherwise, given the difference in size, technology, and more. All this left the North more vulnerable and made them look for alternative ways to somehow defend themselves should the need arise. And they found that answer in Vietnam. It's August 2nd, 1964, and off the coast of a divided Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, the US Navy got into a fight with the North Vietnamese Navy, sinking all enemy ships. Despite winning the battle, the US executive sought out this opportunity to start a war with North Vietnam. Much like in Korea, they had already sent support to non-communist South Vietnam. On top of this, the desire by LBJ alongside American war hawks in Congress to contain communism made Congress adopt the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing the President of the United States to take any measures he believed were necessary to retaliate. So, to protect America's boats, Johnson assumed the most appropriate response was to start an all-out war. However, unlike its previous wars, this war was one that the US could not prepare for. Instead of hills and fields like in Korea or Europe, they encountered jungles instead, with native rebels who knew how to perfectly blend into their environment with guerrilla warfare. This led to unexpected losses for a military that was inexperienced in this field, and the large casualty ratio only made Vietnam a larger priority for the US, moving valuable military resources from Korea and other theaters of potential conflict to supply the ongoing war in Southeast Asia. All other factors aside, this led to the quick and gradual accumulation of US casualties in a war that seemed pretty unpopular by the public. Back in Korea, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, was watching this. He was so impressed by the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare that he made a speech about it at the Workers' Party conference on the 5th of October, 1966. In it, he challenged the status quo of the 1953 armistice itself and highlighted the opportunities given by the sapping of U.S. resources in Korea to handle Vietnam. He also described how the fighting strategy of the Viet Cong showed credible results against American troops. Kim foresaw that if he managed to capitalize on a distracted U.S. Army using similar tactics as the Viet Cong, the U.S. might attempt to reassess its commitments to South Korea altogether, allowing Kim to launch an insurgency in South Korea and reunite the divided people under his rule, a prophecy soon satisfied in Vietnam years later. However, to understand why he believed this would be the end result, it is important to learn context. At the end of the Korean War, South Korea was by far one of the most impoverished countries on Earth. It had a lower GDP per capita, just $79, than many African and Latin American countries, even as they were slowly recovering from colonialism. The South Korean government was consistently very unstable, and many questioned the republic's ability to govern. This all boiled up into the 1960 April Revolution, which led to a brief period of democracy before being forced out again by a coup d'etat led by General Park Chung-hee, seizing power in 1961. This political instability showed the failures of capitalism and democracy, and created a massive propaganda win for the North, which at the time was actually economically superior to the South in many aspects. However, many historians often see the April Revolution as a turning point for the South's fortune. Despite the very undemocratic practices carried out by Park Chung-hee, the new president seems to have managed to turn the country around. He signed new economic and defense commitments with the US and Japan, helping to prevent the isolationism of the country. At the same time, South Korea's own economy began to slowly grow, with massive potential to overshadow the North's originally dominant position. With this in mind, knowing that North Korea would soon lose its strong economic advantage, and knowing that the US was heavily distracted in Vietnam, the decision to take advantage of any resentment from the South Korean populace towards their government had to be done now instead of later. It is this set of circumstances that probably pushed Kim over the edge to start this secret war when he did, further explaining his speech to the assembly that year. Many historians would see this speech as the beginning of the Korean DMZ conflict. Kim assigned Unit 124, the country's black operations unit, to infiltrate the South and to sow the seeds for a rebellion by attacking any aspect of authority. On the 2nd of November 1966, American soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division were ambushed south of the DMZ by North Korean infiltrators. 6 U.S. soldiers were killed. On the 19th of January 1967, North Korean coastal artillery fired into a South Korean patrol boat north of the demarcation line. 39 sailors were killed. On the 12th of February, a patrol boat was ambushed south of the DMZ, with 1 American killed in action. Violence heavily escalated along the DMZ, deaths started to mount, and the Korean DMZ conflict had begun. Coming up next. As national governments ignore the chaos at the border, the troops are tearing each other apart. In the next video, you will hear about how the conflict slowly tiptoes to an official war, an assassination attempt on the South Korean president, the imprisonment of up to 100 Americans by North Korea, and a naval invasion of South Korea's eastern beaches. Like and subscribe, and wait till part 2 drops to see how the conflict unfolds.